End of the Cold War and the Rise of Globalization. Lecture terms. The Post-Cold War World. Focus question. How did Bush and Clinton transform America's world role? The Crisis of Communism. The year 1989 was a momentous one in 20th century history. In April, tens of thousands of student demonstrators occupied Tiananmen Square in Beijing, China, demanding greater democracy in that nation. Inspired by reforms in the Soviet Union and American institutions, workers, teachers, and even government officials joined them, and their numbers swelled to almost 1 million. The protesters were eventually crushed by Chinese troops in June of that year. An unknown number, maybe thousands, were killed, and China would remain a strong communist nation. In the fall of 1989, pro-democracy protests spread throughout Europe. But under Gorbachev, this time the USSR did not suppress the dissent. On November 9th, crowds breached the Berlin Wall. Since 1961, it had been the Cold War's greatest symbol. They started to tear it down. And one by one after that, the region's communist governments in the Eastern Bloc agreed to surrender power. The rapid and almost entirely peaceful collapse of communism in Eastern Europe became known as the Velvet Revolution. But the USSR slipped into crisis. Gorbachev's reforms caused economic crisis and brought long-suppressed national and ethnic tensions into the open. In 1990, the Baltic republics declared their independence from the USSR. In August 1991, a group of military leaders in the Soviet Union tried to seize power and to reverse Gorbachev and the government's plan to give more autonomy to various parts of the Soviet Union. But the recently elected President Boris Yeltsin organized crowds in Moscow that restored Gorbachev to power in the party. Gorbachev will eventually resign from the Communist Party, ending its 84-year rule. And soon the Soviet republics declared themselves sovereign states. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, and 15 new independent nations existed in its place. The collapse of communism marked the end of the Cold War and a great victory for the United States and its allies. For the first time since 1917, a worldwide capitalist system existed. Even China, still ruled by its Communist Party, started to embrace some market reforms and secured foreign investments. Other events seemed to make the 1990s, quote, a decade of democracy. In 1990, South Africa released Nelson Mandela, the head of the African National Congress, from prison. And 4 years later, in that nation's first democratic elections, he was chosen president. This ended South Africa's apartheid system and white minority government. Peace came to Latin America with negotiations bringing an end to civil war in El Salvador and elections won by opponents of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Civilian government replaced military regimes in much of Latin America and in Africa. A new world order. The move from a bipolar world to one of U.S. predominance seemed to redefine America's role in the world. President George H.W. Bush talked about a new world order, but its characteristics were unclear. Bush's first major foreign policy action seemed to return to U.S. interventionism in the Western Hemisphere. In 1989, Bush sent troops to Panama to overthrow the government of Manuel Antonio Noriega, a former U.S. ally who became involved in the international drug trade. Though it cost more than 3,000 Panamanian lives and was condemned by the United Nations as a violation of international law, Bush called it a great success. The United States installed a new government there and tried Noriega in American courts. A deeper crisis emerged in 1990 when Iraq invaded and annexed Kuwait, an oil-rich sheikdom on the Persian Gulf. Afraid that the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein might invade Saudi Arabia, a longtime U.S. ally that supplied more oil to the United States than any other nation, Bush sent troops to defend that country and warned Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait or face war. The policy caused intense debate. Critics argue that diplomacy was still possible and that neither Kuwait nor Saudi Arabia were free or democratic nations. But Iraq's invasion so blatantly violated international law that Bush assembled a large coalition of nations to wage war. And they won UN support and sent 500,000 U.S. troops and the Navy to the region. In early 1991, U.S. forces drove the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. Tens of thousands of Iraqis and 184 Americans died in the conflict, known as Desert Storm. The United Nations ordered Iraq to disarm and imposed economic sanctions that caused widespread civilian suffering for the rest of the 1990s, but Hussein was able to retain power. A large U.S. military establishment stayed in Saudi Arabia, angering Islamic fundamentalists who thought the U.S. presence insulted Islam. But the U.S. military won quickly and avoided a Vietnam-style war. President Bush soon defined the Gulf War as the first struggle to create a world of democracy and free trade. General Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Dick Cheney, the Secretary of Defense, offered two different policy directions to Bush. Powell argued that the post-Cold War world would see conflicts in unexpected places, and that the United States, to avoid becoming the world's policeman, should not send troops without clear objectives and withdrawal plans in place beforehand. Cheney argued that with the end of the Soviet Union, the United States had the power to reshape the world and prevent hostile states from assuming regional power. Cheney argued that the United States had to use force, without world support if necessary, to maintain strategic dominance. 1992 election and Clinton. In 1991, the economy slipped into recession. Unemployment jumped and family income stagnated. Widespread unease about America's future gripped the public, and Bill Clinton, the former governor of Arkansas, seized the Democratic nomination the next year by advocating both social liberalism, like support for gay rights, abortion rights, and affirmative action, but also embraced conservatism in the style of opposition to bureaucracy and welfare. Very charismatic, Clinton seemed interested in voters' economic fears, and he blamed rising inequalities and job loss on deindustrialization. Bush, by contrast, seemed unaware of ordinary Americans' lives' problems. Republican attacks on gays, feminists, and abortion rights also alienated many voters. A third candidate, Ross Perot, an eccentric Texas billionaire, also ran for president, attacking Bush and Clinton for not having the economic skills to combat the recession and the national debt. Enjoying much support at first, Perot's candidacy will eventually wane. But he received 19% of the popular vote, and that allowed for Clinton to win the election with the electoral votes by a substantial margin. This humiliated the only recently very popular Bush. Clinton at first seemed to repudiate the policies of Reagan and Bush. He appointed several women and blacks to his cabinet and named supporters of abortion rights to the Supreme Court. His first budget raised taxes on the wealthy and expanded tax credits for low-income workers, which raised more than 4 million Americans out of poverty. But Clinton shared with his predecessors a passion for free trade. Despite strong opposition from unions and environmentalists, Clinton and Congress in 1993 passed the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which created a free trade zone encompassing Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The major policy initiative of Clinton's first term, however, was the attempt with his wife Hillary Rodham Clinton to address the rising cost of health care and the increasing number of Americans who lacked health insurance. In Canada and Western Europe, governments provided universal medical coverage. Yet the United States, with the world's most advanced medical technology, had a very incomplete health insurance system. The Great Society had given coverage to the elderly and poor in Medicare and Medicaid, and many employers offered health insurance to their workers. But still, tens of millions of Americans had no coverage, and in the 1980s, businesses started to move employees from individual doctors to health maintenance organizations, or HMOs. Critics cited that HMOs charged and denied procedures to patients. Clinton's plan would have provided universal coverage through large groups of HMOs, but doctors and insurance and drug companies attacked it fiercely, fearing government regulations that would limit their profits. Too complex and seeming to expand unpopular federal bureaucracy, the plan expired in 1994. By 2008, some 50 million Americans, most of whom had full-time jobs, lacked health insurance. Freedom Revolution. A slow economic recovery and few accomplishments in Clinton's first 2 years turned voters against him. In the 1994 congressional elections, Republicans won control of both houses of Congress, the first time since the 1950s. They called their victory the, quote, Freedom Revolution. Newt Gingrich, a conservative Georgia congressman who became Speaker of the House, led the campaign. Gingrich devised a platform called the Contract with America, promising to reduce government taxes and economic and environmental regulations. He also promised to overhaul welfare and end affirmative action. Republicans moved quickly to implement the contract's provisions. The House deeply cut social, educational, and environmental programs, including the popular Medicare system. But with the President and Congress unable to compromise, the government shut down all non-essential operations in late 1995. It became clear that most voters had not voted for the Republicans in Gingrich's Contract with America, but rather against Clinton, and Gingrich's popularity dropped after the government shut down. Clinton, however, got the message, and he rebuilt his popularity after 1995 by campaigning against a radical Congress. He opposed the most extreme parts of the Republican program, but embraced others that were popular with the masses. In early 1996, he declared that the era of big government was over, repudiating Democratic Party liberalism and embracing the anti-government attitude of conservatives. He approved acts to deregulate broadcasting and telephone companies. In 1996, over Democratic protests, he also abolished aid to families with dependent children, commonly known as, quote, welfare. At that time, 14 million Americans, including 9 million children, received AFDC assistance. Stringent new eligibility requirements at the state level and economic growth reduced the welfare rolls, but the number of children in poverty stayed the same. Clinton's strategy, called triangulation, was to embrace the most popular Republican policies while rejecting positions unpopular among the suburban middle class. Clinton thus neutralized Republican charges that the Democrats wanted to raise taxes and assist the idle. Clinton's passion for free trade, however, alienated many working-class Democrats, but it convinced middle-class voters that the Democrats were not dominated by the unions. In 1996, Clinton, who had consolidated the conservative shift away from Democratic liberalism, easily defeated Bob Dole, the Republican candidate, in the presidential election. Clinton and world affairs. Like Carter, Clinton was most interested in domestic affairs, no pun intended, and he took steps to settle persistent international conflicts and promote human rights. He was only partly successful, however. He strongly supported the 1993 Oslo Accords, in which Israel recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, and a plan for peace was outlined. But neither side fully implemented the accords. Israel continued to build Jewish settlements on Palestinian land in the West Bank, a part of Jordan that Israel had occupied in the 1967 Six-Day War. The new Palestinian Authority, which shared in governing parts of the West Bank on the way to full statehood, was corrupt, powerless, and unable to check groups that attacked Israel. At the end of his presidency, Clinton brought leaders from the two sides to Camp David to try to work out a final peace treaty. But the meeting failed and violence resumed. Like Carter, Clinton found it difficult to balance concern for human rights with U.S. strategic and economic interests, and to form guidelines of humanitarian intervention overseas. The United States did nothing when tribal massacres in Rwanda killed more than 800,000 people and created 2 million refugees. Clinton also faced crisis in Yugoslavia, a multi-ethnic state that started to disintegrate in the 1990s after its communist government collapsed in 1989. In a few years, 5 new states emerged in that country, and ethnic violence plagued several of these new nations. In 1992, Serbs in Bosnia, which was on the historic boundary between Christianity and Islam in southeastern Europe, started a war to drive out Muslims and Croats. They used mass murder and rape as military strategies, which came to be known as, quote, ethnic cleansing, or the forcible expulsion from an area of a particular ethnic group. More than 100,000 Bosnians, mostly civilians, had been killed by the end of 1993. After long inaction, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, launched airstrikes against Bosnian Serb troops, and UN troops, including 20,000 Americans, arrived as peacemakers. In 1998, when Yugoslavian troops and local Serbs started to revive ethnic cleansing efforts, this time against Albanians in Kosovo, a Serbian province, nearly 1 million Albanians fled. NATO launched a 2-month war in 1999 that led to the deployment of U.S. and UN troops in Kosovo. Human rights became more important in international affairs during Clinton's presidency. They emerged as a justification for intervention in matters once considered to be the internal affairs of sovereign nations. And the United States dispatched troops around the world for humanitarian reasons to protect civilians. New institutions, including courts, developed to prosecute human rights violators, such as tribunals and war crimes courts, regarding Rwanda and Slobodan Milosevic, Yugoslavia's president. Spanish and British courts nearly charged the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet with murder, but he was too ill to stand trial.